Hello everyone, and we are back to continue our drawing series. Today we are going to be looking at the technique known as placement on page. And placement on page has to do with the idea of where you're actually going to put your object when you're drawing it on the page. So with placement on page, I've just written this little blurb for you. You can write it down into your sketchbook as well so that you can refer to it later on if you forget. And basically it's the idea that the closer to the top of the page you put an object, the further away that object is going to appear. And the closer to the bottom of the page you draw your object, the closer it's going to appear to the viewer. So what I mean by that is if you look at your page and you think of this as being the top and this as being the bottom, anything, so I'll just kind of put my grid here. So top and bottom. The idea is anything that's going to be drawn in near the bottom is going to give the illusion that it's actually closer to the viewer. So for example, let's just use our foreshortened cubes that we've gotten really good at. We'll add them in. Make it more of a cube, there we go. And if I draw the same cube and I put it a little bit higher, so I move up the page a bit, notice what's happening when you look at it. I'm drawing it roughly the same size, but it looks like it's a little bit further away. And as we move up the page, we'll just do it on a diagonal. You could do it any way. It doesn't have to be diagonally, but I kind of like the way it looks. There we go. So as you can see, just by moving it, this one is basically here on the page. This one is basically here. This one here. And obviously the higher up we get, the further away it appears. So it's a really easy technique and something to keep in mind when you're drawing to be able to really help incorporate that idea of depth in your drawing and visual space. This is just our bare bones drawing. Again, if we identified a light source, I'll just stick to my usual. And I start adding the other techniques that we've become really good at. So I'm doing some shading, my dark shading on the opposite side to the light source, my lighter shading where it would be a little bit of light. And then if we incorporate our shadows, which we learned last time, and remember with my shadows, I'm thinking about going the same direction as the horizon. So the horizon line where the land and the sky meet up. And so I'm generally making it feel like it would be about the right shape. And of course, depending on where the light source is or what time of day it is, how high above the object or behind the object it is, the shorter or longer our shadows would be. You guys might have played around. I've seen some people have shown me how they've been playing around with objects at different times of the day and noticing how the shadow is affected. So that's really cool. You guys are starting to understand how that works. And so as you can see, by adding even those elements that we've learned in previous lessons, it just makes it feel even more three-dimensional. So that's placement on page, and that can go for anything. So whenever you're drawing things, keep that in mind and remember to use this very simple concept because it does have really strong results. So that kind of is placement on page, but with placement on page, there's a few other things that I want to talk about. They kind of go hand in hand, so I figured we would just do them all in the same lesson. So once you understand this idea of the top of your page, the bottom, and where things are going to fit depending on how far back in space you want them to look, the next concept you want to take into consideration is the idea of size and detail. So when you are thinking about an object, you want to remember that the closer to us an object is, the larger it's going to appear and the more detail it will have. So sometimes when people first start drawing, they might do, you know, a large cube, and then they're going to draw a smaller one. And you can see that just looks like a small cube beside a bigger cube. It really doesn't feel like it's further away. It just feels like it's smaller. And there are some times where that's going to be the case. So know that when you are working with size, if you have two things that are different sizes beside one another, that's totally okay. But if you're trying to make it so that it looks like it's further in space and that's how you're utilizing your size, then you want to think about what we just talked about, and that's the placement on page. So again, you wouldn't do this on your real drawing, but just for reference today, I'm going to do top and bottom, and I'm just doing it on my sketch page. Obviously, if I was working on a real sheet of paper, the very top of my paper and the very bottom of my paper would be what I'm using, but this is just so that you guys can kind of see what's going on. And so when I'm working with size and I want it to give the illusion that something smaller is further back, I'm going to use that in collaboration with placement on page. So for example, maybe I've got a sphere. Let's do that this time just for a change. And I want this one to look like it's closest to me. So I'm going to draw that in closer to the bottom. So if I imagine where that horizon, where it's sitting, it's pretty close to the bottom. If I want to draw another sphere that looks like it's further away in space, as we saw on the last page, I could just draw the same size and put it higher up on the page, and it really does start giving that illusion. But I can actually make it a little bit smaller because I want it to appear as if it's a little further away. And so that second sphere, I'm going to draw it a little bit higher on the page, and I'm going to draw it a little bit smaller. And all of a sudden, by doing that, you're actually making it feel even more far back. So the illusion is getting stronger. And then again, if I wanted to do one behind it, I go further up to the top and I'll do it even smaller. And then finally, the farthest one is going to be even smaller. And again, as I mentioned, it does not have to follow a diagonal. I'm just doing this because I don't know, it's easy. So what I'm going to do is, you know, maybe throw something in here. Maybe I want one that looks a little bit in between these two. So I know that it needs to land somewhere in between. And it's going to be a little bit bigger than this one, but a little bit smaller than this one. And so all of a sudden, it looks like we've got a bunch of these spheres that are all over the place, and they're going back in the distance. Again, we can start adding the other concepts that we know that are just going to help boost that idea. So we can add our shading. So again, our light source, just because it's easy when we're practicing, I'll do it from the same angle. I'm just going to do kind of a scribbly one so that doesn't take lots of time. Actually, I think I might go to my darker pencil. I was using a 2B there. I'll just go to my 6B since I've got one. Maybe some of you guys have found some B pencils lying around too. If you have, that's great. If not, not a big deal. And I'll do that for each one of these. Maybe these are like little balls of wool or something that the cat got into and spilt all over the floor, and now they're rolling all around. That's what my cat does. And this one's a little bit further away. And this one's even further away. And what you'll start noticing is as they get further away, I can't put as much detail. I can't put as much information. One, because they're too small. And two, in real life, if you take a look across the room, what you're able to see from across the room is significantly less than what you're able to see right up front. So if I'm looking at my pencil right here, I can see a lot of information. I can see the small text that's been written on it. And I'm able to see the different edges, the different highlights, that kind of thing, what kind of material it's made out of. So I can see it really up close. If, however, I was looking at a pencil that was across the room and just in a pencil rack or like laying on a table or something, I wouldn't be able to see all of that detail. And so when I'm drawing it in a sketch, you want to mimic that as well too, because if you can see the same amount of detail back here as you can here, your brain kind of thinks, oh, that doesn't seem really realistic. That's not really what I could see in real life. So when you're even with your shading, it does not have to be as detailed the further back you go. Your shadows, again, they're going to have a real impact on creating that feeling that these are actually sitting on some kind of a surface. And again, I'm using that horizontal lines. I'm not putting lines in like this. If I put lines in like that, it just really flattens everything out. So again, nice horizontal. My shadow gets smaller too, even as I go further back. And then depending on what these objects are, maybe these actually are some apples that I've just set out to kind of play around with. I probably wouldn't want to use scribbling if that was the case, so maybe that was a bad idea, but just to give you the idea. Obviously this apple that I'm looking at, I can see a lot more detail. I can see the stem. I could even see possibly the foreshortened circle of the stem. This one I'll be able to see a little bit more. And also I'll be able to, I use the circle as my guideline, but an apple generally isn't a perfect sphere. And so I can go in and just kind of fix the lines the way I want so it feels more apple-y or whatever it is that you're drawing. And the stems don't have to all be the same way. So maybe this one's a little bit different. I'd still be able to see part of that. It's not too far away. This one I'm going to see a little bit less of. It's getting further. I can still see the general shape, that it's a little bit different. This one definitely a whole lot less. And this one, geez, I probably can't really see anything but the shape of it. So as you can see, the detail, there's more detail the closer you get, and it's larger. And it's also closer to the bottom of your page. So this is how you use the concept all together. Actually, we've used pretty much all the concept that we've learned so far. So we're using our size, our detail, our placement on page. We've got our shading, our shadows, and we've even used, I was going to say maybe not foreshortening, but my stems had a little bit of a foreshortened circle there too. So that's just how you're going to incorporate all of those things together. Now, the last thing I want to show you before we head off is that you don't necessarily need to do this for separate objects. So although each of these are separate apples, and so we're able to easily draw them smaller and further up on the page, there are some times where you're going to have an object that is maybe long, or it's starts at one end of a room and goes to another end of a room. And so you're going to want to use these concepts in using that one single object as well. So I'm going to show how to do this just by using the idea of a skipping rope. Okay, so what we're going to do is just start with a foreshortened circle, but this time I'm going to have it sort of on the side. So remember how to do that. And I'm going to turn it into a cylinder. So again, remember the main thing with a cylinder is not flattening it out. We keep this curve the same. I'm just going to switch to my other pencil because my 6B is so soft, it's hard to get in my starter lines. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a second foreshortened circle around this. And what this is going to be is sort of the we're going to draw a skipping rope. So skipping rope that's lying at one end of the room or one end of the driveway and then kind of snakes around to the other end. So this is the handle that's closest to us. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to have the rope snake around a little bit. And you can do it however you want. And then I'm going to draw the second part to give it some width. And remember, as it's getting further away, it's getting closer to the top of our page, and it's also getting smaller. So see how it's still the same object, but even the same object can actually start getting smaller in size. And it's definitely the part that we want closest is the lowest on our page, and the part that's going to be farthest away is definitely at the top of our page. I'm going to put the other handle in. So I'm going to start just by having a foreshortened circle. And again, I'm going to cap this with a nice rounded line. And then I'm going to draw the other end and cap it off. And we wouldn't see this part because it's off on the other side. So now what we're going to do, that's kind of our rough in of our skipping rope. And now what we're going to do is just remember our rules about detail, and we're going to start putting some details in and some of our shading, that kind of thing. And then it's just going to bump up the illusion even that much more. So what I'm going to do is probably my handle isn't a perfect cylinder. Sometimes, you know how they have like kind of rounded, it rounds in like that. So because this is close up, I'm going to do that. I don't really have a good eraser today, so I'm just using this one. But again, if you're not erasing, it doesn't really matter. We're just using this as our practice. And if I was going to use these concepts on a real drawing, I would obviously make sure I have an eraser handy. But for my sketchbook, I don't get too worried about that. All right, and then we have our rope. We want this to sort of look a little bit rounded, and maybe I can even give the illusion that it's made out of some kind of rope or some kind of twine or something like that. So if that's the case, closer up, I would see some of those lines within the rope. And then as I get farther away, those lines would get further away, or would get smaller and less detailed, because remember, detail is something that we keep in mind too. And when I'm putting these lines in, I'm just remembering to follow my curves, because that just gives us added feeling that this is some kind of a rounded surface. If I put just straight lines, it would have really flattened it out. And again, we're just kind of laying in the first little bit. She can always go in and add more detail. I don't like how much I put in here, so I'm just going to erase this a little bit. I like how it ended up a little bit better than how it started, which can happen. So I'm going to just space them about the same as the ones near the end. But again, these ones, when we put in our shading, I put my shading on this side, so what side does that mean my light source isn't on? If my shading is on the right side, it means it's coming from here, right? So that means that's where my shadow would fall too. And remember, my shadow is going to go straight horizontally. I'm going to shade this in a little bit. Shade this in. Looks good. Down here is my darkest. And I would just work along, adding those details and making them less detailed as I move further up I'll just show you. It's still going to have shading, so you're still going to have shading, but it's maybe not going to be quite as precise or not quite as obvious with the lines. Like these lines we can really tell. These ones it might just be more every now and then and a color. The main thing is though to always keep it rounded, or curved I guess is actually the more correct term. And remember, this would, if this light source is coming here, this would have light. That's why this side doesn't. And again, our shading, or sorry, our shadow is always going to stay horizontal. So always going along following the horizon line. It really just gives your object the sense that it's grounded and actually sitting on something. And I usually go in and just start a little bit light, and then if I want to make it a bit darker, if I think it needs to be a bit darker, then I can go in and do that. And I can beef up this darkness here a little bit for more contrast. Contrast is always what we're looking for in a pencil drawing because it gives us a lot of variation in tones and really helps your image pop and your eye draw in and see what cool stuff you've created. So hopefully you can kind of see how that's going. Obviously you can work along a little bit and really make it look pretty awesome the more time you spend on it. But those are the key things that I really wanted to show you, and just how you can incorporate all of the techniques that we've learned so far into your drawing. One last thing I would note is sometimes if people have an object like this, when you think about this arm, it's kind of off the ground. So right here is where the ground would be, and this is above it. So just one little tip, sometimes when people are starting with shading, they'll just go in and put the shading right underneath as if it was on the ground. But in fact, this isn't. And so our shading is actually going to start a little bit under it. And see how that even further gives us the illusion like, oh, this is off the ground. And now I kind of get to see how this is all sitting and lying down. This one would be the same. So we wouldn't put the shading right under here because it's not actually touching the ground. So what you would do is just have a little shading coming off like that. And again, it just gives that illusion that it's off the ground. So hopefully this lesson has shown you how you can use detail, shading, shadows, placement on page, and size to further enhance the illusion of depth and three-dimensionality in your artwork. And you've seen how to do that on individual objects, but you've also seen how you can incorporate it into a single object as well. So I would encourage you to practice this technique. Again, if you're feeling kind of inspired, I would encourage you to maybe find a couple of objects and place them out and try drawing them. And I would really definitely encourage you to practice this type of an idea. So taking a fairly large object and seeing if you can make it look further back in space just by using those concepts that we've used today. You can use simple things like this pencil. I mean, if I have a pencil and it's going back in space, you can see that the tip is higher on my page, right? And the bottom is closer. The bottom is bigger than the tip. So you could actually practice even with something as simple as a pencil and just laying it on the page and, you know, seeing if you can do that. So have fun using these new skills. You should be noticing some serious improvements in your sketching abilities at this point because you have done 7 lessons already. And next time we're back, I'm going to teach you a few more techniques to add to your creative toolbox. Until then, have a great day.